So you don't want to sunburn, but you want to be tan. And you want to be tan, but you also want to have a lot of circulating vitamin D. How is this even possible? Let's talk about it. I'll see you inside. So today we're going to take a look at the process of actually creating your own vitamin D from the sun. And interestingly, this process actually starts in the liver where we produce a specific molecule called 7-dehydrocholesterol or 7-DHC. And now inside the liver, this 7-dehydrocholesterol can either go towards the creation of cholesterol in the liver, or it can actually be sent to what are called the keratinocytes in the skin. So when it's in the skin, we actually need UV light between 200 and 315 nanometer to turn 7-DHC into what's called pre-D3. And interestingly, this is the only process that actually needs sunlight. While pre-D3 is not actually the form that our body utilizes, the conversion of 7-DHC to pre-D3 is the only process that actually needs the sun. And once we have this pre-D3, we actually want to get out of the sunlight, because if we continue to expose these molecules of pre-vitamin D3 to more UV radiation, they can actually be converted into different molecules called lumisterol and tachysterol. And these molecules really just seem to accumulate inside of the cell, and when we go into darkness, can actually be converted back into pre-vitamin D3. But once we've actually created this pre-vitamin D3, it can be slowly turned into vitamin D3 simply using heat. So when taking a look at it, at 0 degrees Celsius, no pre-vitamin D3 actually seems to get converted into vitamin D3. However, at 37 degrees Celsius, pre-vitamin D3 is slowly converted into vitamin D3. Therefore, it appears that the best way to actually create the most vitamin D3 would be getting short exposure to sunlight, followed by a prolonged exposure to warm temperatures. And this is called the thermal conversion of pre-D3 to D3. So now if we spend too long in the sunlight, we may actually convert this pre-vitamin D3 into different molecules that we can't actually use. So it seems that the shorter, more frequent bouts of sunlight exposure are best. And now there's another reason why this can actually be so beneficial, and this is actually due to the production of melanin. So the longer we spend in the sunlight and the more intense the UV radiation is, the more likely we are to develop DNA damage. And as a response to DNA damage, we will actually create a pigment called melanin. And what melanin does is it actually takes that UV light incoming from the environment and emits it back into the environment as heat. However, this kind of steals the UV radiation from this 7-dehydrocholesterol molecule, and we do not inevitably make as much pre-D3. And this is why we have found that people with darker colored skin have a much more difficult time creating their own vitamin D3 when exposed to the sun. It is this melanin pigment that makes the skin darker. So if you really think about it, technically the process of tanning may increase your vitamin D3 production. However, once you are tan, it actually makes it more difficult to increase your natural production of vitamin D3. And if you really think about the heat component, this is why it's much more difficult to create vitamin D in the winter. The sun is still out during the winter at typically the exact same wavelength. However, oftentimes you may not be able to warm the skin enough to actually have the pre-D3 be converted into vitamin D3. So it appears that at noon we'll have the highest production of vitamin D3, but you do not need to be in the sun for as long. And in the early morning, we can still have the exact same vitamin D3 production. We may just want to be in the sun for a longer period of time. And really, the best period of time to be in the sun is as frequent as possible without burning. And once we have produced the actual D3 in these skin cells, the rest of the process is fairly simple. So vitamin D3 is actually brought to the liver by what's called vitamin D3 binding protein. And inside the liver, it's converted into a new molecule called 25-OHD. And now in a healthy person, once we actually have this 25-OHD molecule, the body does an extremely good job of regulating our vitamin D. Extra vitamin D can be excreted or stored, and it's typically stored in places like the liver and the fat tissue. And then when we need vitamin D for things like increasing our calcium or phosphate levels, we will do what's called mobilization, where we simply take this 25-OHD to the kidney, where it is actually turned into the active form of vitamin D, which is called calcitriol. And this is typically referred to as the hormonal form of vitamin D because it can actually bind to the receptors and exude its effects. And now, the biggest and most predominant function of vitamin D is actually to elevate our blood or plasma calcium and phosphate levels. And this is extremely important because calcium plays a role not only in bone strength, but in every single neuron, every single muscle contraction, the production of the majority, if not all, of our hormones, the regulation of our blood pressure, and the regulation of our electrolyte and fluid balance, and so much more. With that being said, if we're producing vitamin D or calcitriol, we're actually going to be removing calcium from the bone to get it into the bloodstream because we have low blood calcium. So on the membrane of different cells, we have what are called VDRs, or vitamin D receptors. And now this is extremely interesting. So the receptor of vitamin D actually sits inside whatever the target cell is. And vitamin D will enter the cell and actually bind to the vitamin D receptor. And this receptor will also do what's called heterodimerization, where it simply binds another protein, and this protein is called the RXR protein. And now once these proteins are together, they will actually bind to other molecules called activators or repressors. And all of this really just depends on what cell or what tissue this is occurring in. However, really the big thing is what occurs at what are called the vitamin D binding response elements. So once whatever complex that is going to form is formed, it binds to specific pieces of the DNA called vitamin D response elements. And these pieces of DNA actually encode for specific proteins. And now, this could be a ton of different proteins, but all of these proteins are going to be enzymes, channels, or other sort of intracellular proteins that are going to help us rebalance our calcium and phosphate homeostasis. So if we look at the intestine, it's going to do a ton of things that will help us increase our calcium absorption. For example, it increases the production of a specific protein called calmodulin, which is the major protein that will bind calcium. And then it will increase the production of another protein called calbindin. And this will take that calcium and actually transport it into cells that can release this calcium into the bloodstream. But to release it from the cells, we need more of a specific transporter called calcium ATPase. And luckily, vitamin D increases the production of that protein as well. And now this is in the intestine, where vitamin D works to help us increase our calcium absorption from our diet. So whatever food we take in, we will absorb more calcium and excrete more calcium into the bloodstream. And then we can move to the bone, where vitamin D will actually increase the amount of calcium that we are storing in our bones, strengthening our bones. And if we move to the kidney, it increases our reabsorption of things like calcium and phosphate. So all of these mechanisms actually work to increase our reabsorption of calcium and phosphate. But it does have some other actions. So the reason this vitamin D production actually occurred in the first place, at least turning it into its active form, was due to the production of what's called parathyroid hormone. And this hormone actually responds to low levels of calcium, and in return it will increase our production of vitamin D, the vitamin D in its active form. Well, this actually works as a feedback loop because vitamin D will stop the production of parathyroid hormone, so we do not raise our calcium levels too much because we have too much vitamin D. It will actually bind to a receptor on the parathyroid gland, which is where parathyroid hormone is produced, and will stop further production of this parathyroid hormone. calcium also has a feedback loop on the parathyroid hormone, and calcium can work to reduce the production of parathyroid hormone. And this occurs through a specific receptor called the calcium sensing receptor. And another hormone produced as a result of this vitamin D is actually this specific calcium sensing receptor. So we have a greater sensitivity to any calcium in the environment. So instead of helping to increase our blood calcium and phosphate, what vitamin D will do at the parathyroid gland is actually inhibit us from increasing our blood calcium and phosphate too much. And now one of the most interesting functions of vitamin D is actually at the pancreatic beta cell, and this is the cell that's responsible for producing the hormone insulin. And it appears that in the beta cell, it will actually increase the beta cell's absorption of calcium. And calcium is actually used to allow the little vesicles that contain insulin that sit inside of these cells to bind to the membrane and release the insulin into the bloodstream. And now, because the immune system is so complex, the exact mechanisms by which vitamin D impact the immune system aren't necessarily certain. And if they are, for that matter, I am not necessarily certain in giving you the exact mechanisms. However, it does appear that vitamin D seems to decrease our inflammatory response to pathogens. However, it doesn't seem to decrease our ability to cope and fight with them. What I mean by this is that inflammation is actually a necessary part of the immune system because it's how we actually find, locate, and destroy all of the pathogens inside of our body. But sometimes the body has an over-inflammatory response where we simply react to pathogens in an extreme manner, and the amount of inflammation we produce isn't necessary to actually fight the pathogen itself. And now vitamin D almost acts like a flu shot. And what I mean is that the reason we get a flu shot is so that we get the initial large increase in inflammation, but since the injection has such small amounts of the pathogen, it's almost unnoticeable. But if we come into contact with the flu virus again in the future, we have what's called the adaptive immune system, where we already understand how to properly deal with this pathogen in a non-inflammatory or at least mildly inflammatory manner. We simply become much better at fighting off the pathogen, and we produce much less inflammation as a result. And vitamin D seems to do the same thing. It doesn't seem to inhibit our ability to fight off any pathogen, and it may actually increase our ability to do so. And the way that it's typically described is that vitamin D gives us less of an inflammatory phenotype in response to any sort of immune cascade. And in one of the areas that this could actually be very helpful is actually something called autoimmune disease. And this is when the body is mounting a very extreme response to actual healthy cells inside of our body and causing a lot of internal inflammation. And some studies have showed a role of vitamin D in actually suppressing this extremely inflammatory response that we are mounting for almost no reason. And in this case, we will reduce the symptoms of an autoimmune disease. So in terms of the immune system, we have some molecules that work to increase inflammation, and we have some molecules that work to actually resolve the inflammation and kill the pathogen. And it appears that vitamin D does a very good job at decreasing the production of these very inflammatory signaling molecules. However, it increases our production of the molecules that are actually necessary to fight off the pathogen, and benefits this adaptive immune response so we can better fight off things in the future. And now vitamin D seems to help increase calcium uptake by certain cells like the heart and the skeletal muscle. So in the heart, this actually increases our ability for cardiac contraction because calcium is used for muscle contraction, and it does the same in skeletal muscles. And while it could be for many other reasons, a lot of people who have vitamin D deficiency report muscle weakness. And this certainly could be the cause of having low levels of calcium and phosphate getting into the muscle cells. It seems to increase the production of certain hormones in the pituitary gland, once again because of the important value of calcium in the stimulation of hormone release. With that being said, I hope this podcast was helpful, and I really couldn't even scratch the surface of all of the things that vitamin D does in the body, but I hope I gave you a little bit of insight as to how we can actually increase our own natural production of vitamin D. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you listen to the next episode. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.